Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am your host, Lucas Draga, and I look after pre-sales here at AgilePoint. Now, I'm still seeing a few of your colleagues dialing in here, so why don't we give them another moment or so before we go ahead and get started. All right, so our attendance numbers are looking pretty good here, so why don't we go ahead and jump in. For those of you who have just joined us, I'd like to welcome you to today's session. Today's topic is one that has generated lots of interest over the past few years, and that is meeting the automation demand within SAP. Now, SAP is a household name. Many of you are very familiar with the company and their broad technology offering. But for those of you who are not familiar with SAP, SAP is an ERP platform, and being ubiquitous in the market is an understatement to some degree. Now, the workloads that SAP carries are in many cases very much akin to the crown jewels of any organization that uses it, right? And while it is key to many businesses and delivers a tremendous amount of business value, it is not without its own challenges, right? And it's those challenges and the corresponding opportunities that the AgilePoint platform can unlock that we'll discuss today. Now, before we go too much further, I suppose I should introduce myself for the folks who are speaking with us for the first time. I am your host, Lucas Draga, and I look after pre-sales here at AgilePoint. And for those AgilePoint webinar diehards, it's great to see you once again today, and I am eternally grateful for your continued support, and especially to those of you who have given me feedback over the years. And if you're just joining us, very glad to have you on the line today. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we've got a great agenda for you today that deals with one of the most popular topics among our customer base. And that is, how can AgilePoint help your organization extract even more value from SAP? So as far as today's agenda is concerned, we're going to run you through some common challenges that we see in using SAP and how AgilePoint can help overcome them, as well as a few of the primary use cases we're seeing when pairing AgilePoint and SAP. I'm also going to tell you a little bit more about our go-to expert SAP resources in Clear Process Solutions, and finally, give you a better idea of exactly how these two platforms can work together. Now, after I wrap up the slides and the demo, please feel free to stick around if you have any questions that may come up throughout the course of the webinar. We've set aside about 10 minutes to go over those questions as a group. Now, as we mentioned earlier, I know there are a few of you on the line today who are speaking with us for the first time. So let's quickly cover a little background on AgilePoint and how we might help your business. So as you can see from the tagline, AgilePoint is the industry's first all-in-one intelligent process automation platform for the enterprise. The AgilePoint platform helps companies enable an agile operating model to dramatically improve operational performance, accelerate time to market for custom software, expand employee engagement, unlock innovation, and improve quality. Now, what this means in practice is that while most, say, BPM or RPA automation solutions handle only specific categories of applications, AgilePoint has been architected to address the widest possible range of application requirements on one single platform. So as a result, our clients typically require fewer low-code tools and IT support resources and deliver the industry's lowest total cost of ownership. Now, our industry-first, unique, model-driven abstraction design has proven to slash delivery time by up to 90%. And on the other hand, yields applications that are easily adaptable at runtime, are highly performant right out of the box, and are impervious to server restarts and crashes. So with all of this, there are more than 2,000 global customers, many of the world's largest and most trusted brands, trust AgilePoint to drive their agile transformation programs. So far, all of this must be sounding pretty good, right? But you're wondering, where exactly do I use AgilePoint? So as you can see from the graphic on screen, AgilePoint is equally at home with both process and data-centric sorts of use cases, which makes for an extremely versatile platform to jumpstart your transformation. So from a process perspective, these are the applications that speak to what McKinsey calls the agile operating model and automation at scale. The coordination of customer path to purchase, as well as internal end-to-end journeys. So you can think of strategic items, right? Hire to retire, automated onboarding, quote to cash, and contract management processes that improve operational performance, increase employee engagement, which is particularly important as most of us continue to work from home. Now, on the other side, we have the data-centric applications. These tend to be a little more tactical in nature, where a user interface sits on top of a backend data source for data entry. So think of a CRUD application or data in, data out, right? A UI that sits on top of a database, Salesforce, for instance, or many other systems, and has no process associated with it. So now, once I've built these applications, they're instantly mobile enabled, including for offline use, even in a mobile app that carries your company branding, logos, and images, and completely personalized for your visual identity. And then lastly, these applications are highly portable across deployment channels, like on-premises and cloud, even across clouds to reduce or entirely eliminate lock-in. Run the apps where you want, integrate the systems that you need, and move them without any refactoring or any rebuilding. Okay, so let's take a look at a few SAP use cases. And broadly speaking, SAP is at the core of our customers' operations. It typically addresses areas such as finance, logistics, and HR, so the list of potential use cases is nearly limitless and may vary from one organization to another. Of course, because SAP can do so much, it often means that lots of customization is required for it to do exactly what you need. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the coming slides. For now, you're seeing a number of use cases up on screen. But in short, combining AgilePoint with the built-in functionality of SAP enables you, the customer, to support the internal and external journeys you want with none of the headaches. So let's take a look at a few of them. One that I think will resonate with just about everyone on the line today is customer onboarding. Right? There's been lots of talk in this area in recent years around how do we create a frictionless and delightful customer journey. Right? Many of the markets that your businesses compete in these days are crowded, right, with immense competition, and this area is often viewed as one of the remaining battlegrounds to create a truly differentiated offering. Now, certainly, the customer journey starts well before SAP, right, but once the sale is closed, it really kicks up into a higher gear. So these are the processes that help get your customer spun up quickly and capture accurate, high-quality data, including typical due diligence and know your customer protocols. You can facilitate credit checks and improving credit limits, and generally speaking, feed the necessary data to other downstream departments and systems. Now, another common use case that we see quite a bit is with respect to journal entries. Right now, every organization needs an accurate, to-the-penny accounting of all financial transactions, and that's where journal entry processes come into the picture. Now, journal entry is typically one of the starting points for SAP automation in our experience, particularly among our larger customers. That being said, right, everyone needs an accurate log of all financial transactions. They're key to day-to-day operations, and of course, month and year-end closing. And the last that I'll speak to today is really an area of focus for many of our customers as of late, as well as a burgeoning category for AgilePoint OEMs that build prepackaged solutions on top of AgilePoint, is procure to pay. Now, this typically involves the integration of purchasing and accounts payable functions to create synergies and efficiency in how we select goods and services, how we uphold compliance along the way in those processes, receiving and reconciliation, and finally, invoicing and payments. But, as is often the case, except with AgilePoint, of course, is that a large, especially an older platform, can have some challenges associated, and that is certainly the case with SAP. Now, as mentioned previously, in many ways, SAP is a complex, arguably esoteric platform that requires skilled resources to use, administer, and certainly to develop against, customize, or integrate. Now, recent estimates place an SAP developer, of which you'd likely need many to get SAP doing exactly what your business needs, is at an average of $140,000 US. Now, multiply that by the handful that you'd likely need, and the costs tend to add up pretty quickly. Now, one of the other challenges that we're seeing here, I would say strictly on the user side, is let's just say that SAP is not as inviting as some of the more modern business systems that you might be familiar with. The UI is quite dated and unintuitive, and often requires extensive training simply to navigate, right? Which is not a great recipe for widespread user adoption. And then finally, the cost of SAP licensing itself is astronomical. If you consider a professional user for a perpetual license, we're looking at roughly $3,200 per seat just to use the software out of the box. So with all of these factors, right, they tend to add up. The power of SAP is certainly undeniable, but certainly there must be a better way. And that's exactly what we'll talk to you about in the coming slides. So far we've learned that SAP is a very competent platform, but certainly comes with a few limiting factors and maybe a few quirks that you need to get used to. So it's with those things in mind that pairing AgilePoint and SAP enables our customers to access the critical data they need to run their business, with AgilePoint delivering the powerful and easily adaptable processes they need to support their operations. So what we'll do here is leveraging both standard and custom SAP BAPIs from SAP HANA and ECC for up-to-the-minute, real-time data integration to deliver fully featured, enterprise-grade processes and user interface forms. Not only that, but we can connect SAP to any other line of business system, take Salesforce here as an example, without writing a single line of code. So in short, using AgilePoint, you're free to design your processes how you want to deliver the journeys that you need, whether that's simply retrieving and writing data back to SAP, or connecting AgilePoint processes to the internal flows in SAP, all while maintaining rigorous compliance. So using AgilePoint's connector for SAP, you won't need those costly developer resources that we mentioned in the prior slide to create these highly adaptable front and back office processes. So some of you are probably wondering, what does this mean in practical terms to my business? Well, in short, much stronger capabilities with a much greater ability to exactly meet and oftentimes exceed the requirements from the business side. When we're talking about extending and enhancing SAP functionality, we're no longer resorting to custom code. Right? What would otherwise take weeks and a quite extensive budget to custom code in SAP can now be implemented in a matter of moments using AgilePoint's extensive drag-and-drop application composition functionality. Right, what's better, when those requirements evolve or entirely change over time, we're not going back to extensive re-engineering cycles. Right? Again, we're visually updating a model, and our application instantly reflects the latest in business requirements. Now, you don't need to take my word for it, right? But Gartner views this as the path going forward. Right at the bottom of the screen here, you're seeing a quote that indicates that 70% of applications developed by enterprises will use low to no code technologies in the next couple of years. Right? And there's a real reason behind this, right? Of course, we can custom code this sort of functionality directly into SAP or whatever our system of record may be. But I think you guys have seen this story before. If I take that approach, what happens when it's time to go through the next upgrade cycle? Or when it's time to move that workload to the cloud? Now, the AgilePoint approach of tight integration with a loosely coupled architecture means that I'm free to make these changes, to run SAP where my business requires, and to instantly be able to make these customizations with a fraction of the total cost of ownership and a sharply reduced time to value for this custom functionality. So that's the what, right? This is more of the why or the how, right? So how does AgilePoint interact with SAP? What do we interact with behind the scenes? So as you're seeing here, right, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, AgilePoint can consume any SAP BAPI, whether that's a standard or a custom BAPI, any RFC-enabled SAP functions, and then, of course, the underlying SAP tables themselves. Now, what does this mean in practical terms? Well, of course, you'll see activities in the AgilePoint automation builder to call these functions that I mentioned just a few seconds back, the ability to retrieve SAP data on a user interface form, and then, of course, the mechanism to connect to SAP itself, right? We call these access tokens, and this enables us, with no code, to interact with SAP. So with that being said, let's see a little more detail on all of these items that I've just mentioned here. So the first piece here will be with respect to the automation builder. Now, for those of you who are familiar with AgilePoint, you know that when I build a flow, this can be a combination of automated actions or human activities. So obviously on the SAP side of things, this is going to come in on the system activity side of things, right? This is where we can invoke those standard and custom BAPIs, those RFC-enabled functions, and then, of course, interact with the underlying SAP tables. You'll see a little bit more of this in the designer during the latter portion of the webinar. Now, beyond the process, we want to be able to retrieve data and show it to the user on a user interface form. So this is where AgilePoint's powerful no-code lookup functionality comes into the picture to retrieve and display data on the form. And then finally, the connection string to SAP itself. As you're familiar with AgilePoint, you may know that we call these access tokens. And AgilePoint has a very unique approach, not just with any sort of integration, but specifically as it relates to SAP. So you may have heard me mention just a few moments back that for any system, of course SAP is included, no code is required to interact with the SAP system. But what's more, we're taking that to the next level by being able to pass through the logged in user's credentials at runtime. Right, and this is important, right? If you're using AgilePoint and SAP in some sort of mission critical use case, right? Master data management or customer onboarding, or for journal entries as an example, you want to know who committed that transaction to SAP. Not very helpful if you see a generic service account. So being able to pass through the logged in user's credentials as we're committing a transaction ensures that the audit trail is fully maintained with the highest level of integrity if it ever needs to be reviewed, God forbid, down the line. Okay, so just some closing thoughts here on how AgilePoint and SAP integrate. You're probably wondering, what sort of changes do I need to make to SAP? Well, if you look at the slide, nothing. This is going to support all SAP ECC and HANA releases and requires zero modification to your existing SAP platform. No dependencies on SAP gateways or NetWeaver as an example, and gives us that ability to easily bring in both SAP data as well as third-party systems into a fully featured application. So in short, you get a much higher level of agility and in turn a much more resilient organization with zero changes required to your SAP platform. All right, now before we go any further, I wanted to take a few moments and talk about AgilePoint's go-to resource for all things SAP, and that is Clear Process Solutions. Now, CPS, as we call them, has been an AgilePoint partner since 2015, and as I mentioned, is our go-to resource for anything SAP. Now, the folks at CPS have built a tremendous AgilePoint practice, as well as a broader reaching management consulting practice, have developed significant expertise in all things manufacturing, and typically leverage AgilePoint alongside SAP to, of course, reduce the total cost of ownership, as we've discussed, bring in data from multiple line of business systems to facilitate instantaneous decision-making, and of course, to reduce something that everyone hates, and that is repetitive data entry, and to provide enhanced visibility across processes at large scale. So if you're in the market for SAP work, would like a trusted partner to work with you in your AgilePoint deployment, please feel free to reach out to CPS and tell them Lucas sent you. Okay, so with that being said, let's go see a quick demo showing AgilePoint and SAP working side by side. Okay, so as you can see here, I've just switched gears and I'm now within the AgilePoint UI. And in the designer, I've opened up the process model for our demo application. Now, the demo use case for today is to create a purchase order within SAP. So as you can see here, for our purposes, we've kept the demo application fairly straightforward. We have one human task to input the details of the purchase order, and then 3 activities to create the PO in SAP itself. Now we'll show you a little bit of behind the scenes here, but for this use case, we are calling one of the standard or out-of-the-box SAP BAPIs to create a purchase order. And on the left-hand side of my screen, you'll see that I have the SAP Integration stencil opened up. Now, for those of you who are familiar with AgilePoint, you're probably noticing something slightly different about our SAP integration as opposed to, say, Salesforce or SharePoint. Where Salesforce has roughly 40 configurable and reusable process activities, and SharePoint has about 65, only 3 here within the SAP stencil. Now, don't let this fool you here. With these 3 activities, as we mentioned earlier, I can bring a lot of power into my AgilePoint business process. The first activity that we have here is to basically open up the bridge or our connection into SAP. The second is to call a function. Now, this can be a number of different items behind the scenes here. This could be a standard BAPI, like the one we'll use today for creation of a purchase order. This could be a custom BAPI that your team has developed. I can invoke RFC-enabled functions, as well as interact directly within the underlying SAP tables. So now that we understand what's happening behind the scenes within our application, let's take a look at a few of the application components. What we'll do first here is take a look at our responsive form that we've created. And as you can see here, this has all of the details to create a purchase order in SAP. We have all of the header fields, as well as the various line items. Now, in the case of line items here, this could be a repeating structure in case you have multiple items within your PO. Now next, let's take a look at the actual configuration of SAP Integration itself. So you'll see here, I have the SAP call function activity opened up. And the first thing that I've done here is I've selected my connection string, right? In other words, the connection string that I've been given permission to use to interact with SAP. And from the drop-down list here, I've selected one of the standard BAPIs called Create PO. Now down below here, you're seeing both an input as well as an output mapping. So let's take a quick look at how that works. So on the left-hand side, I have all of my AgilePoint attributes. This could be process data, this could be form data as an example. And on the right-hand side, I have the SAP data structure. So it's simply a visual mapping exercise, mapping like for like from AgilePoint to SAP. So this covers off our input parameters. And you'll see here, I followed a very similar process with respect to the output mapping. So with that being said, having understood the inner workings or behind the scenes of this application, let's move over to the Work Center and we can watch this application at runtime. Okay, so to kick off our process, let's go ahead and click the tile here to launch the application. And as you can see here, my responsive form is now rendering here within the browser. And to save some time and potential embarrassment in entering in data incorrectly, I've set some default values here for the various fields on my form. So as you can see, I've populated all of the header details, as well as all of the line items down below. Now, as we mentioned earlier, this could be a repeating structure. If I needed multiple line items in my purchase order, AgilePoint can easily account for all of that. So with that being said, there's nothing left but to click Submit and to launch the workflow. Now for the data to be passed to SAP and to actually create the purchase order itself, takes about 15 or 20 seconds or so. So in another moment, I'm going to bring up my SAP VM and I'm going to show you the purchase order that was created. So if I go ahead and get this out of the way here, you're going to see my SAP window showing here on screen. I've zoomed in quite a bit. Hopefully you can see that. I apologize for the hit in quality that it's taken here as a result, right? But this should give you a sense of that instantaneous integration, right? That ability to write, retrieve to SAP as a part of a broader business application in just a matter of a few moments. So with that being said, let's go back to our slide deck here and we can finish the webinar. All right, so what you've just seen there was an example of a process that interacted with an SAP BAPI. Recall that there is also integration at the user interface level in the form of a data lookup. So with that being said, just a few quick slides here in closing. For those of you who are again speaking with us for the first time, know that AgilePoint has what we like to call a bigger out-of-the-box offering than most of the other low-code platforms in this marketplace, right? And it really all kind of comes down to the items that you're seeing here on screen. So the first of which is the large integration framework, right? Of which SAP is one of 85 integrated systems now. This slide is a little bit out of date. The ability to easily model processes of any complexity, right? And this really comes back to support for 15 of the most common business process patterns, right? By that, I mean things like sequential or parallel processing, voting scenarios, as well as various hierarchical process patterns. You saw an example of our responsive form builder, right? So here I have 70 pre-built user interface elements that I easily drag, drop, and configure onto the canvas. And keep in mind that these have been optimized or built to address certain data type scenarios, certain use cases. So I'm configuring my validation and my expected inputs rather than going to things like JavaScript or regular expressions. And then lastly here, with respect to the actual integration itself, you saw this during our demo scenario, and that is the visual integration with those various 85 systems that are pre-integrated into AgilePoint. Right, so again, the idea here being, I don't need to be an expert to interact with SAP or Salesforce for that matter. I follow a very intuitive 5-step wizard and visual configuration, as you're seeing here on screen. Okay, so that concludes the content that I had for this webinar. Why don't we go ahead and take a few questions? All right, thank you, everyone. So we're here for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so in case you have any questions on what you've just seen. Okay, so I'm getting a question here with respect to licensing of the SAP connector. Yes, this is an additionally licensed component, right? This is a component that we've OEM'd from another provider, and as such would not be included with the other 84 out-of-the-box connectors. But one thing to keep in mind here is that we typically see a very large reduction as it relates to SAP licensing itself. Right. In our findings, most of our customers end up with roughly 20 to 30% more SAP licenses than they actually need. So the cost of the SAP connector itself is certainly more than offset by the savings that you would realize with respect to SAP licensing. It's a great question. Okay, I'm getting another question here around data ownership. Yes, absolutely. So the customer does retain the data in just about every scenario, I should say. And that can be persisted into systems like SAP, stored in really the provider of your choice, right? And yeah, just to reiterate, AgilePoint does not own the data. That is 100% the domain of our customers. So no issues there. And even in the case of an AgilePoint hosted environment, right? This is something that you would have access to at any point in time, right? At some point, should you move away from an AgilePoint subscription, right? That data would be returned to you in the format of your choosing immediately. Okay, so I'm getting a question here with respect to the ramp up or training period in order to interact with SAP. I would say, the biggest challenge as it relates to integrating with SAP from an AgilePoint point of view is really understanding some of the quirks of SAP itself, right? I think, one of the things that we've found is that the visual mapping that you saw as a part of the demo, right, is obviously very straightforward, right? But exactly how do I map, right, to which nodes in a data structure? That requires a little bit of SAP knowledge, right? So really, I'd say the bulk of the effort is around understanding which BAPIs to call, right? How to map the data, right? And this is really all complexity that we typically see introduced on the SAP side, right? So great question. Okay, we'll keep the line open for another moment or so here. Go ahead and pop in with your questions. I'm seeing another question here with respect to triggering of workflow. So there's different ways that this can be addressed in AgilePoint, right? I would say as a whole, AgilePoint is a 100% event-driven platform, right? So by that, I mean everything within AgilePoint raises an event. Right. That being said, there is also an event framework that we can use to initiate workflows from other systems. Now, as of today, that includes systems like databases, inbound emails, file drops into a folder, or what we call a scheduled service, right? Where we might need a workflow to trigger on a weekly schedule, let's just say every Monday morning at 8 o'clock. So that is the out-of-the-box event offering, right? One of the great aspects and really strong suits of the AgilePoint platform is the extension framework, right? So we like to think of AgilePoint as having a bigger out-of-the-box offering than most of the folks that we compete with,
right? But keep in mind, you're not going to run into a brick wall at some point, right? There are many points of extension, right, with respect to form controls, human task types, integrations, right? But also at the server level, right? Of one of which might be, creating an event for SAP as an example, right? So if something were to happen in SAP, maybe data gets added, changed, removed, what have you. That could also potentially be a trigger type for an AgilePoint process. Right now, being that this is part of the extension framework, I would say, low to medium .NET skills would be required to make that happen. But, typically something that we see, lots of customers availing themselves to, right, is that ability to extend the AgilePoint platform in every direction. It's a great question. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions for the time being. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed what you've seen and can't wait to see you on the next one. Until next time, bye-bye.